It's a question most footy fans would have pondered at some point. What would a modern day State of Origin tournament look like? You'd have all the best players in the AFL representing their state, which then follows on to the next question, which state would be the best overall? In today's video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a best 22 for each of the states as though a State of Origin tournament was happening, and essentially I'll be picking the best 22 comprised of players that originally came from that state. Now we know that rugby has a long, rich history of State of Origin competitions. The AFL by comparison has a bit of one, and you go back to 1977, the first time we saw Western Australia and Victoria take each other on in a game of football. The whole notion of a State of Origin competition in Australian rules football sort of came to address the fact that a lot of players from interstate leagues were drifting towards the Victorian competition because there was a stronger and more financially viable competition happening over there. Now I don't know a whole heap about rugby, but my understanding it was a similar sort of reason as to how their State of Origin competition started, where supposedly the rugby league competition in New South Wales was attracting a lot of the best Queensland talent. So that was kind of the genesis of State of Origin competitions, and in 1977 we had a couple of games between Western Australia and Victoria. In the first game in June of that year, Victoria beat WA by a margin of 63 points, and then they had a rematch on the 8th of October that year where Western Australia defeated Victoria by 94 points. It would take about 12 years for South Australia to enter the mix. Apparently in 1989, Victoria played South Australia in a game at the MCG, which attracted a crowd of 91,960 people. For a variety of reasons, the interest in a State of Origin competition really dwindled around the 90s, and arguably that was because the Victorian League was sort of expanding into what is now the national AFL competition. From what I can tell, the last State of Origin competition with AFL players playing in it was back in 1999. So there was a 22-year span where this competition existed, and it hasn't really resurfaced since. If you're a young whippersnapper like me, you will remember there has been sort of almost State of Origin concepts revived for various reasons. Back in 2008, we had an AFL Hall of Fame tribute match between Victoria and a dream team, which was comprised of every other state other than Victoria. That was to celebrate 150 years of football. More recently, in around 2019-2020, there was a bushfire relief match between Victoria and the All-Stars. Similar sort of concept, everyone except Victoria playing against Victoria. So that's a brief history of what the State of Origin concept is, and the reason I suppose we haven't seen it really come back into the mix since then is probably just due to scheduling issues and the fact that 18 clubs have their own players to look after, and finding a time of the year where all these players can take part in these competitions, and of course the risk of injury and detriment to each club's preparation. There's a whole heap of reasons why it doesn't happen now, although I'm sure we'd like to see it happen again sometime in the future. And part of this video is to try and sort of follow that curiosity a little bit further and see what teams would look like in 2024. So what I've done is I've picked the best 22 for Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia, and an Allies team. The criteria for picking players, obviously I've just picked modern day players, but to qualify for that particular state, they had to have played, a large majority of their junior football in each state. And there was a few ones where it was a little bit awkward for me. So to give you a couple of examples, Tom Hawkins was born and bred in New South Wales, but played a lot of his teenage football in Victoria. I'm going to make him eligible for Victoria in this video. And then there's a couple other types like Alia and Charlie Cameron, who both were drafted out of Western Australia, but are predominantly Queenslanders based on where they played their football, etc. So it's now time to go through these teams one by one. I'm going to give you a snapshot of what the team looks like, their best 22s, and ultimately we can come up with a consensus of which one would be the best team. So to kick things off, let's talk about the Allies, which are comprised of players from Tasmania, Northern Territory, Queensland, and New South Wales. Despite being comprised of players from non-traditional footballing states, the strength of this hypothetical 2024 side is quite fascinating. Arguably, their strength is their tall defensive trio, which includes 3 All-Australians in Harris Andrews, Alia, and Stephen May. Their forward line is also dangerous, featuring names like Tex Walker, Charlie Cameron, and Luke Bruce. This team also boasts 2 of the game's brightest young midfield talents in Errol Goulden and Tom Green. So this is the Allies 22 that I've put together, and to be honest, it's a little bit stronger than I expected. Tall backs, outstanding. Harris Andrews probably the pick of that bunch, but then medium types in guys like Jeremy Howe, who's from Tasmania originally, Daniel Rioli from Northern Territory, and Nick Blakey from New South Wales. That's a really damn good backline. The midfield's pretty good, but I suppose all of these teams are going to look good on paper. It's how they compare against each other. But like I said, you've got a couple of young guns in Tom Green and Errol Goulden. Callum Mills, obviously a really important player for the Swans there. I have chucked Taron Thomas into this team. Again, this isn't so much based on 2023 form. This is kind of me just picking who I think are the best 22s available. So for me, Taron Thomas made it just ahead of guys like Ben Keys. Isaac Heaney makes the bench, but you look at how strong the medium forwards are in this team. Luke Bruce for a start, Zach Bailey, Charlie Cameron. Myercheck's kind of like an undersized tall, but he's good for 40 goals. Hipwood kicked 40 goals this year. Taylor Walker had an outstanding season as well. So it's a pretty balanced team, and when you look at the bench options there, Kitty Coleman makes this team. Toby Nankervis as a backup to Jared Witts. It's a pretty well-rounded team, and I know that we're comprising 4 states here into one, but I think we're going to continue to see the evolution of the Allies as a football breeding ground for a number of years to come. And when you consider how many players were drafted out of Allies states in 2023, you can only imagine that this team would look stronger again in 5 to 10 years. There were a few names that was hard to leave out, guys like Zach Williams, Jimmy Webster down back. Bailey Scott was a guy I originally had in the team, but I just ousted him. Matthew Kennedy also is eligible to play for him as a New South Welshman, I believe. Forwards as well, Lockie Schultz, who I only found out was originally from New South Wales while making this video. Charlie Dixon, Jeremy Finlayson, but I'm happy with the 22 that I've picked there. Now let's move on to South Australia. South Australia is a proud footballing state that has produced a whole stack of AFL talent for generations. The 2024 team possesses a star-studded midfield, spearheaded by dual Brownlow medalist Lachie Neale and a couple of stars in Connor Rozee and Jordan Dawson also in that mix. Their tall defenders are another strength, with All-Australian fullback Cal Wilkie backed up by 2 younger guns in Charlie Ballard and Brendan Cox. While their tall forwards aren't overly strong, they do boast 3 of the game's most dangerous small forwards in Isaac Rankin, Tyson Stengel and Kozzy Pickett. So with the Crow Eaters, the first thing that comes to mind is their backline. I really like that mix of Wilkie, Ballard and Cox. You do get the sense that Cox and Ballard are probably, still approaching their prime, but the medium types as well, Caleb Daniel, Mason Redman, Nazai Wanganeen-Miller. It's a pretty young backline, to be honest there, and the one behind them I've picked as the experienced head is Brodie Smith. The midfield's interesting. I have slapped Will Day on a wing there. I know he's probably more of an on-baller, but sometimes with these representative teams, you have to play fast and loose a little bit with that sort of stuff. But the on-ball division of Neale, Rozee, and Dawson is absolutely top end. And Mitch Hinge is probably a little bit of an underrated player outside of the Adelaide Crows, but analysing, the best options for this, I felt like Hinge was the best option for the wing there. I really like the small forwards in this team. Isaac Rankin, Tyson Stengel obviously coming off, the 2022 season was outstanding. He was decent again in 23. The one that's a little bit contentious here is I've picked Harrison Petty as a forward because for whatever reason, South Australia's key forward options just aren't really that deep. We've got Fogarty and Lukosius, a couple of players that you feel like are going to really crack it big time at some point, particularly Lukosius in my opinion. Harrison Petty probably going to line up at a key forward role for Melbourne this year, so he makes his team as a key forward. Brodie Grundy's probably my choice is number 1 ruck, but Sam Draper's kind of right there with him. So when you also consider Kozzy Pickett on the bench, Rory Laird as well, this is a pretty damn good team. But before we really assess how good it is exactly, we have to kind of compare it to Western Australia, who we'll talk about next. While WA is another proud footballing state, I have to say the current State of Origin side in 2024 looks a little weaker compared to previous generations. That being said, it isn't without its elite talent, particularly when it comes to talls. Oscar Allen, Aaron Norton and Sam Taylor bookend this side, all 3 of whom are high quality guns from the 2017 draft about to enter their prime. The ruck department is also particularly strong, boasting this year's All-Australian ruckman in Tim English, supported by Fremantle's Luke Jackson. This side also features 2 Brownlow medalists in Patrick Cripps and Tom Mitchell, while 2023's Norm Smith medalist in Bobby Hill also features. So picking WA's 22, as you can see here, was kind of tricky. I feel like it's kind of lacked the top end talent that it used to have a number of years ago. I mean, Buddy Franklin has just retired. Nick Nat-Nui's just retired. Nat Fyfe has probably, faded out of this team, and I haven't picked him, perhaps controversially. And it's filled with a lot of players probably approaching their prime. So maybe in a few years this team will be better. But let's go through it specifically. So like I said before, the talls of this team look really good. Norton and Allen, I feel like, will be long-term gun key forwards. You got Logan McDonald in the mix. I didn't have him in this team, but Jai Amos is another backup option in this team where you feel like in a few years he might just crack this team. But Luke Jackson there with Tim English, like it's a really strong set of tools when you also consider Sam Taylor's probably the pick of the bunch there as one of the best key backs in the game, alongside Tom Barras, who I kind of think is probably the next best. You know, the other key back options that I considered were the McGovern brothers, if you consider Mitch a key back, Griffin Logue, Nathan Broad, a little bit past his prime. But the medium types are solid without being absolutely elite. You got names like Starcevic, Baker, Elliot Yeo, still a good player, but constantly injured. Trent Rivers is really on a steep incline, in my opinion. Nick Martin is one of the better young wingmen of the competition, so he's probably one I should highlight there. And a couple of midfielders there that, you know, were stars or like elite at one point and probably just faded a little bit. Maybe that's a little bit harsh, but Tom Mitchell, Patrick Cripps, Stephen Canelio, all very good players, but you'd say maybe 2 or 3 years ago, all three of those were at a higher standard. I don't know, Patrick Cripps probably the outlier there because he did win a Brownlow just last year, but I hope that point makes sense. But the medium forward types are also like Shea Bolton is an absolute weapon, as is Bobby Hill, who's just really made a name for himself with his Norm Smith medal performance. And Sam Powell-Pepper is probably an understated defensive forward of the competition right now. The bench was tricky. I decided to go with Tim Kelly on the bench. I do think he's better than people really appreciate now because people don't really watch West Coast that closely. But Zurha makes this team, and a couple other ones. I really wanted to include Michael Walters. I really wanted to include Liam Ryan, but it was a little bit tough to split those, and Zurha's probably the best of the three currently. Like I said, I just couldn't quite fit Nat Fyfe in this team. You know, obviously the Fyfe of yesteryear was a walk-up start and probably the first player picked in this, but it's been a little while since he's really proven himself, and I wouldn't even know where to put him. I wouldn't put him in the midfield over some of these midfielders, and I wouldn't put him in the forward line either, but probably in terms of reputation, the best legacy of any WA player in the competition right now. So overall, it's a solid WA team, a lot of players that could be better in 3 years, so it'd be interesting to revisit it then. But for now, let's talk about Victoria. Victoria's State of Origin side could easily pass for an All-Australian team and is comfortably the strongest side on paper. The backline features names like Sicily, Moore, Stewart and Dacos, while the midfield is headlined by Bontempelli, Petrarca and Butters. Then there's the forward line, with Coleman medalists such as Charlie Curnow and Jeremy Cameron featuring, as well as Giants captain Toby Green. So Victoria, understandably, is unbelievably strong. Like, we'll start with the backline there. As I said, Sicily, Stewart as the sort of intercepting types. Jacob Wiedering's probably the next best Victorian key back that I can think of to partner Darcy Moore, who is a walk-up start. Nick Dacos, obviously a walk-up start, and I did include Jack Sinclair in this team, slightly ahead of Dan Houston, but you could kind of go either way with that. I've cheekily put Sam Walsh on a wing. I know he's more of an on-baller, but he probably does have the outside game, and by contrast, Josh Dacos is a pure wingman, so I did quite like that selection. But Bontempelli and Petrarca are probably two of the best three players in the competition, and the other player that I'd probably highlight is Toby Green, who's on this forward flank as well. Charlie Curnow, Jeremy Cameron and Nick Larkey as the three talls. I'm including Dusty a little bit on legacy, but I do kind of think he has become a little bit underrated, almost because Richmond have faded a little bit. People haven't really noticed that Dusty had a really good year as a permanent forward. So we got a bench of Took Miller, Dan Houston, Caleb Sarong, Bailey Fritsch. I think all of those players are really stiff to be on the bench. But there's a few other players that were very unlucky not to make this team. It really pained me not to include Clayton Oliver, but to some extent, you got to favour the guys who have been better over the last year or two. And I think Caleb Sarong deserves that. I think Took Miller deserves that. Jai Newcomb is right on the fringes of this team. You got a couple of good backup rucks to go on there in Ron Marshall and Sean Darcy. And the other one that really pained me to leave out was Tom Papley, but I decided to go with Bailey Fritsch and Dusty Martin as those kind of medium forward types. That was a tough one, but I just couldn't include him. So with that all being said, how do we rank these? I think it's clear Victoria is going to be the best team. Absolutely. But who's the second best team? To be honest, looking at that, I honestly think the Allies might have the second best available 22 there, from what I can tell. Probably doesn't have the depth of other states because the unlucky players to miss out list was shorter for me. And then probably South Australia eclipses Western Australia. So we'll see. Again, this is just a moment in time. It just appears that Western Australia's strength isn't quite what it used to be, but you feel like in a few years when Norton, Allen, Amos, Logan McDonald, admittedly they're all key forwards, hit their prime. Nick Martin as well probably still has a gear to go to. Starcevic. It's not going to catch the Victoria team. They produce too much talent, and you can tell that by watching the draft every year. But it's interesting to map this team out, or these teams out, as it currently stands in 2024. But let me know in the comment, guys, what you think. Who is the strongest team out of these, and what changes would you make to the team that I've made? It is hard. It is really hard to try and canvass the entire league for all the players that deserve to be in these teams and find out what state they're in. And then further to that, all the little nuances like Lockie Schultz is not actually Victorian, he's from New South Wales. O'Leary actually is not from WA, he's from Queensland. But I've probably made a couple of errors, but let me know in the comments anyway. And yeah, it's a bit of a fun exercise. So I look forward to seeing your input in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.